Okay, well, Christ is risen.
Indeed.
It's good to be with you all today. It looks like this is a largely St. Elizabeth Orthodox Church in Paulsbo event, though I know we have some visitors, and I'm really happy to see those visitors. This event grew out of a kind of a vision, an idea in our parish that we're not really satisfied just to keep to ourselves way up there off of Highway 3 behind the Breidablik Cemetery, in that little church building that scarcely even looks like a church building, but we really want to be present in part of the community of Paulsbo. We want to, because we are members of the community of Paulsbo. So this is like other talks we've given in the past here at the Sons of Norway. We've done this in the past. This is, I think, the fourth time we've organized an event here, and so I hope it's interesting for everyone, both parishioners of St. Elizabeth and also members of the public who are here today. Maybe having heard about it at the Viking Fest or some other way. I was very pleased to see out on the road here the sign that says names the event right there on their marquee, their signboard. It's very, very nice to see that. Today is the first of 6 talks that are collectively being called Summer with the Saints, and it is a series of talks that'll be every other week. The first one is here at the Sons of Norway today. Subsequent talks, the next 5, will be on a schedule of every other week, every other Saturday, same time, but a different place. And that place will be our church. At 4:30 to 5:30 on those Saturdays, we'll be meeting not here, but at our church for the subsequent talks. Those talks, I will just name right here. I think everyone probably has seen these handouts, but I'm just going to skim through them really fast here. After Sanctity and Sin in the Christian Tradition, or How a Sinner like King Olaf of Norway was Canonized, which is today's talk. 2 weeks from now at our church we'll have a talk entitled The Girl Who Defied Social Expectations, about wealth, wisdom, and beauty, Great Martyr Catherine of Egypt. It's quite a title, quite a mouthful of a title, but it's a very interesting part of her story as a saint. Then on June 29th, which happens to be the feast day of Saints Peter and Paul, at our church, Saturday, June 29th, 4:30, The Invincible Beauty of Humanity, Archbishop Basil the Great of Anatolia. On July 13th, A Woman in Power, Empress Theodora of Byzantium. On July 27th, Speaking Truth to Power, Metropolitan Philip of Russia. And finally, August 10th, God Can Create Beauty Amid Total Desolation, Mother Olga of Alaska. That last one's a very special one because she will be canonized at some point, maybe between now and then, or certainly this year or very soon. So why these saints? Why these 6 saints? Well, these 6 saints are, all of them, very interesting by themselves. I hope you'll see Olaf today is very interesting. All these saints are very interesting by themselves, but the main thing from our parish's point of view is all these saints are going to be on our ceiling at our church when they're painted by our iconographer Brian Vorlich later this year. We've now had big murals painted on the eastern wall and on the western wall of our church, and now within the barrel vault that goes down the center connecting those 2 walls, we will have these and other saints, a total of 24 saints. Along one side, following Christian tradition, we will have female saints. On the other side, we will have male saints, 12 of each of these, 24 in total, and they will all be facing east, facing the altar, facing paradise, because Genesis tells us that paradise was planted in the east, and that's why we face east. We're oriented when we worship as Orthodox Christians. Facing east, facing their salvation, and at the very end of this barrel vault, right over the altar table, will be an icon of the ascension of our Lord Jesus Christ into heaven. And so all of it oriented toward that communion with Christ that begins in this world and finds its fulfillment in the world to come, the kingdom of heaven that is promised to us as Christians. So this is going to be above us as we worship, and it's going to be a wonderful way for us to remember what it means to be a Christian. And so these talks are designed in part to show the public, as much as people are interested in it, what goes on in our church and what our church believes about the saints. It's also designed for our parishioners, or those becoming our parishioners, to learn more about what we have in our church and why those particular people are up there in that ceiling, 24 of them. So tonight's talk is going to focus on one of those saints, King Olaf of Norway. King Olaf of Norway. And it's taking place in the Sons of Norway building here in a city called Little Norway by some people, with a large Norwegian heritage, and I hope it's of interest to everyone as we talk about it tonight. We'll go until about 5:30. I'll probably break a little early, maybe 15 minutes early, to give us a chance to discuss or ask questions or discuss anything that comes up in our talk today, okay? All right, so let me get started then by bringing attention to the very title of this talk, Sanctity and Sin in the Christian Tradition, or How a Sinner like King Olaf of Norway was Canonized. Sanctity and sin. Most Christians understand that there are people called saints, but there's often very little understanding of who those saints are and why they're called saints. So just to start this whole series of talks, to get thinking about those people that will be up in our ceiling, I think it would be helpful for us to take a moment and think about what is sainthood. What is sainthood? In the English language, we know that saint is a word that usually is associated with a person who is recognized as being an exemplary Christian. An exemplary Christian. Furthermore, someone who is an intercessor, someone who cares about people living in this world, even though that person has already died and gone to heaven. We don't really use that phrase, but this kind of idea. And that the person therefore has sanctity. Sanctity makes a saint. But we also should know in the English language that in addition to the word saint, we of course have that word holy, holy. And in most languages, there's no difference. There's no difference. English is kind of unusual in this respect, in that we have a title, saint, that we put before a certain holy person's name, and then we have the adjective holy to describe such a person. Sometimes you even see, it's kind of silly, you see you see it written, the holy saints or something like that. It's redundant, the holy holies is what that really is. The saintly saints, it's redundant. It's the same word. What we realize in the Christian tradition, which we Orthodox Christians are so concerned about, we believe that we change nothing about our faith, that it was given by Christ to the apostles, and that the apostles handed it on from there, and it's been handed on ever since without change over the course of 2 millennia. What's so important to us in understanding the Christian tradition about sainthood is that to become a saint means that the person baptized into the body of Christ, which is the church, participates with Christ and the Holy Spirit in their very life. A saint is someone who participates or partakes of, it can be put differently, in the holiness of God. And the scriptures are very clear that only God is holy. No one has any innate holiness whatsoever. No one has any innate holiness whatsoever. No one has this. Everyone is a creature of God and has nothing holy about them by their very nature. Now, that can be qualified by noting that everyone is made in the image and likeness of God. This is biblical Christianity. And so being made in the image of God suggests that one is therefore made to become holy. But one is not holy unless they have a relationship with God, who is the only holy one, according to Scripture. And so saints, therefore, participate in the holiness of God. And in a certain sense, we can put this differently, but in a certain sense, to be a Christian means to participate in God's holiness or to become a saint. And this, again, is used in Scripture. If you read the New Testament, when Paul writes epistles, he writes his epistles with statements like, to those Christians in such and such a place, comma, called to be saints. Or the book of Acts talks about how the saints of such and such a place were doing such and such a thing. The word saint is actually more commonly used in the New Testament as a kind of name for a Christian than the word Christian. There's no question about this. And so people baptized into the church from the beginning, from that first century, which is so important to us Orthodox to retain what was given and handed on in that first century by the apostles, people then become saints insofar as they participate in the saintliness of God. He's the only saint. He's the only saint. Okay, so that's really important for us to understand. But there's another word used in the title of this talk that kind of helps give sense of it. And this is really important for us, I think, living in the modern world. And that is sin. We often think of sainthood as being the opposite of sinfulness. And in a certain sense, it certainly is. But the saint is not the opposite of the sinner. And what we're going to see as we talk a little bit tonight about St. Olaf is that he was a sinner as well as a saint. He was a sinner as well as a saint. We want to understand that. The human being, by being consecrated, by membership in the church and being given the gift of the Holy Spirit, the human being is sanctified, becomes part of God's holiness. But the human being does not cease to be someone who is not God, but rather a creature subject to all the darkness that every creature on earth is subject to. That is to say, sin. And so all saints are also sinners. And if that sounds a little impious, if that sounds like not completely pious to say so, let's just think for a moment about all those statements and all those examples from saints' lives in which the saints, what saint thought of him or herself and is recorded as saying, I'm not a sinner, I'm a saint. Something like that. Like, no one says that. No one says that. All the saints are recorded as having a profound sense that they are sinners. In fact, we can say there's a kind of a spiritual law, a law of piety. The more holy one becomes, the more saintly one becomes, the more they become convinced that they are not God. They are not holy. That their holiness is something that they have, that they're given by God, but it's not something they own or possess themselves. There's all sorts of saints' lives that talk about the saints and their humility this way. But maybe the easiest way for us to think about this is 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 15. I think it's verse 15, yes. 1 Timothy 1:15. We Orthodox repeat it at every divine liturgy. It's Paul speaking about the reality of things, and he says, this is a true and faithful saying, that Christ came into this world to save sinners, of whom I am first. We know that because we say it as Orthodox Christians across the planet every Sunday at the divine liturgy before receiving Holy Communion. If Paul can say that, then all of us also need to be able to say that. And our understanding, therefore, of the sanctified humanity that the church generates and produces in people like Olaf of Norway, that sanctified humanity does not simply, kind of neutralize all sin within humanity, like some sort of magical force. But people who are sanctified this way are struggling, are working, are laboring, are fighting a struggle to become saintly. And that is what the Orthodox Church is all about, being a hospital for the sick, a place where people who have tasted the holiness of God learn to become like God, learn to become holy the way God is holy. And this process is something that takes a lifetime. Now, one of the final things I'll say by way of kind of preface about especially Olaf of Norway, but all the saints we'll be talking about this summer. The other thing is I want to emphasize that sanctity, that sainthood takes place within this world. It's not like saints somehow just like, are disconnected from the world and they start to float up to heaven or something like that. Like our icon will show the ascension of Christ into heaven, right? But it'll also show all the apostles standing below, looking up at Christ ascending into heaven. And if you read at the end of Luke's Gospel and the beginning of Acts that describe the ascension, the angel says, "What are you doing? Like, what are you staring at? Why are you looking? Get to work." In other words, get to work where? In this world. The angel tells all the apostles who are standing there watching Christ ascend into heaven before Pentecost comes, before the Holy Spirit, the Holy One, comes and fills them at Pentecost. They stand there looking up at heaven, and they're almost scolded by the angel. It's not quite a scolding, but it's almost like that. and they're instructed by the angel, why do you men, stare up at heaven? In other words, the suggestion is get to work. And get to work where? In this world. So this cosmos, or world, is the place in which sanctity, sainthood, you just say salvation generally, is worked out. And so all the saints then that we recognize as canonical saints, saints that are authorized for us to really venerate and think about, even pray to, those saints then lived in this world and worked out their sanctity in this world. And this last point I'm trying to make before we kind of launch into the subject matter of Olaf and his times, this last point is really important because we live in a world in which there's sometimes a Gnosticizing tendency to look on Christianity as something that has nothing really to do with this world. And the more truly Christian one becomes, the more they become disconnected totally from this world. And of course there are, the example of the monks who leave society, not the world. That's often said, that a monk leaves the world and goes to a monastery. Well, welcome to the monastery where all the world is as fully represented as ever. All the stuff, all the passions, all the gluttony, all the lust, all the pride, all the anger, everything's at a monastery that's also in a city. So this idea of leaving the world is kind of a exaggeration or distortion of reality. What really happens is holiness is worked out in this world. And there was a saint, a really important canonized theologian of the earliest times. He lived in the 2nd century. His name is Irenaeus of Lyon, who wrote a book called Against the Heresies. And in this book called Against the Heresies, which he considered to be a really important act on his part to fight against misrepresentation of Christianity, he said that the basic problem we have in the church is we have a lot of people who are Gnostics. They believe in gnosis or gnosis, which is the Greek word for knowledge. And all they're really interested in just is learning and thinking, and they think that's how they're going to achieve salvation. But a Christian works, a Christian lives, a Christian acts. And what Irenaeus said was, Christianity is a faith, unlike Gnosticism. Christianity is a faith in which the world, the material, physical world, with the body that people are given as part of their humanity, just like their soul, participates in and is sanctified by the Holy Spirit, sanctified by God. And so this is very important for us to understand. We should never think of the saints as people who just kind of checked out of the world and had nothing further to do with the world. They lived in the world. They lived in families. They lived in monasteries. Sometimes they went straight to their death as martyrs, bearing witness to Christianity in whatever worldly circumstances they found themselves. And that, brothers and sisters, is the case of Olaf of Norway. So let me turn now to the example of King Olaf of Norway by way of introducing him a little bit in his historical context. Olaf of Norway lived in the 11th century. He died in 1030. Olaf of Norway was king of Norway. As you know, driving around Polsbo, there's the king, isn't there the King Olaf parking lot right up here? I think it's called King Olaf parking lot. So we know he's a king. He is probably he's definitely the most famous king of Norway. And he died in 1030 and was immediately canonized. And by the way, what does canonized mean? It means the word canon in Greek means ruler. Ruler. It means like yardstick. It means like something you measure with. And so like canonization means a process by which you measure whether or not something is authoritative, good, appropriate, holy, okay, Christian. And so canonization is the process by which, in this case, a saint is declared to be a ruler of the faith. That is to say, a kind of a yardstick, a kind of measure of the faith. Okay, and he was canonized very soon after his death, Olaf of Norway, and King Olaf II, and more specifically Haraldsson, and so he was canonized. Now he lived in the world, and the world he lived in was 11th century Scandinavia, or even more broadly actually, 11th century Christendom. Christian civilization. So about 1,000 years after Pentecost, or about 1,000 years ago from our point of view, in the 11th century. And he was born into a particular time and place of this world, namely Scandinavia at that time. Now at that time, Scandinavia, before Christianity, had certain features to it. And I'm obviously not going to get into like a history of Scandinavia lesson here. Some of you would be able to do that better than I can do it. But Scandinavia, you know, is famous for the source for those Vikings. And I'll mention them in just a moment. But it wasn't, you know, all Vikings. You know, it wasn't all long ships and battles and so forth. Most Scandinavians were just peasants, right? Just peasants, especially in the inland areas of Scandinavia, Norway or Sweden or Denmark. And Scandinavia had a long heritage of pagan religious belief as well. Figures like Thor, Odin, right? You know, and all the others. Some people are specialists at this these days. Very popular. I think isn't there an annual event here in Poulsbo that's like what is it? The summer thing fest. What was it? Well, it's not the Viking.
We already had it.
I think there's actually a pagan celebration, kind of quasi, not too seriously religious. Just kind of. Isn't there something that goes on? Where they march with torches or something? What is it?
Midsummer.
What is it?
Midsummer.
Midsummer, yeah. Does that sound right to everyone else too? Midsummer, yeah. I mean, I think it's just kind of having fun with, you know, all that pagan heritage stuff. There are a lot of people who are really into, you know, Viking and Scandinavian paganism these days. Some quite seriously, most of them just kind of like as a kind of a you know, a hobby or something like that. Well, that was, you know, to some extent, that was obviously real, and there were real beliefs, and there were strong convictions among those believers in Scandinavia in that 11th century from which Olaf comes. And finally, and I mentioned this a moment ago, of course, is the rise of the Viking raids that come from Scandinavia in the late 700s or 8th century. The first of these raids, and they all depended on certain things that the Vikings happened to just do right, including the technology of the longboat. The first raid was famously or infamously on Lindisfarne on the east coast of England, where there was a very famous Celtic-inspired monastery for the Saxons in England. And the Lindisfarne had been established by Saint Aidan, the Irish Saint Aidan, who came to Lindisfarne and established it and helped convert the Saxon English to Christianity. By the way, Aidan's going to be up there too, just a little kind of advertisement for that in our church. He'll be up there. Lindisfarne was sacked and all its treasures taken away, along with a lot of slaves. And so a lot of monasteries all over the littoral or the coastline of Western Europe were subjected now to, you know, more than a century of raids by these Vikings. They were very effective raids, and the Vikings took off a lot of wealth and a lot of slaves, and left a lot of burning buildings and dead bodies behind as they did so. And so it was a very militant, violent, like unbelievably violent, like merciless culture. Merciless. There was no mercy. It wasn't like, you know, the Vikings would come in and, you know, they'd negotiate if the people were ready to negotiate, or they'd raise their battle axe or something, and someone would cower and they'd say, okay, I'm sorry, you know, just, you can live your life and I won't bother you anymore. I mean, that wasn't it. It's like, kill everyone and take everything, and no remorse, because their religious beliefs secured them in that behavior. Their values were kill, pillage, and feel no remorse. In fact, you know, the berserkers and all those types, they thought they were going to heaven insofar as they killed in this kind of maniacal way and stole the wealth of these Christian communities. So that's the world. That's the Scandinavian world. Again, most of the Scandinavians were not these violent Viking raiders. They were just peasants living on the land, following the pagan religion of their ancestors and so forth. But these Vikings kind of were really kind of a noteworthy part of that world. And that's where power was. That's where power was. And so there were a series then of leaders from Scandinavia, the Norsemen, who were from this part of that world, this very militant, very aggressive, very remorseless part of the world. And before Olaf's time, there were a few other kings that came along. The first king of Norway kind of united Norway together. And then after him, there were other, even Christian kings. And I want to talk about how Christianity actually found its way into this world, this culture, this ethos of violence, because it's really striking. And that's one of the things we have to understand when we evaluate Olaf as both a saint but also a sinner who's a canonized member of our church. And so let's just turn to that. Scandinavia was like one of the last little pockets of pagandom in 11th century Christendom, in 11th century Europe. It's just a little pocket. There were some places in Central Europe as well, here and there, but most of Europe by the 11th century had become Christianized, at least on the surface. And Norway was one of the last places this occurred. And what was obvious is that these Viking warlords and chieftains who would go out and lead these campaigns of raiding would then be sacking Christian lands. And they'd come into contact with a lot of people, and eventually that had an effect back in Scandinavia and Norway on their beliefs and values. They would bring back, for instance, a lot of slaves. Sometimes they would bring back slaves that they would make human sacrifices for. And these Christian slaves, of course, they were taken from monasteries in many cases, meaning, not always, but sometimes that's a high level of Christian commitment. These monks that they would capture and enslave and sometimes put to death back in Scandinavia, these people were, their world was what? Reading the saints' lives. Saints' lives feature martyrdom, the martyrs. Hearing the gospel of Jesus Christ, a gospel centered on the cross and sacrifice. Taking up the cross and following Christ and knowing that suffering in this world will be transformed into joy, even in this life, but especially eternally in the kingdom of heaven. And so these people were being brought back to Scandinavia, and the Scandinavians and Norwegians were encountering these people, even the Vikings. And so with time, the holiness of these monks started to rub off, you might say, on these otherwise really brutal Scandinavians, and they began to convert, not in large numbers, but in small numbers. But we have some evidence that there was already conversions going on even before the 11th century. Well, there were a couple of efforts at uniting Norway together into one kingdom. In a time when there were many other kingdoms and powers that be, maybe most immediately was the case of Denmark under Canute, King Canute, who not only ruled Denmark, but even was able to gain power in England of the 11th century as well, and for a time, as we'll see, was the political force behind the demise and death of King Olaf of Norway as well. Canute had been baptized, he was a Christian, and he represented kind of the transition to Christian statecraft in Northern Europe during this time. Other parts of Europe, of course, had long been Christian in their mode of life, statecraft and otherwise. Like, for instance, of course, Byzantium in the south was a long-term Christian state. So was the Holy Roman Empire in what's kind of modern Germany and France. England and Britain were now Christian, and as was Russia. By 988, Russia has started to convert to Christianity. And so there's all these different political states around Norway that are Christian and acting in certain ways like Christians, even though their rulers are often quite brutal. If you take, for instance, one of the founder, you might say, of that Holy Roman Empire in Germany and France and part of Italy, his name was Charlemagne. He was crowned by the Pope of Rome in 800. Charlemagne was brutal in his rule. He went to war against the Saxons. That's not the English Saxons, it's the Saxons in Germany. And he put them to death, and he conquered them, that is. But he told those that he conquered, in some cases, you either convert to Christianity or prepare for death. baptism by the sword, it's called. It was very brutal, but that's how statecraft was done. Is that how evangelization is supposed to be done? No. So just as on the record, Father John is saying that St. Elizabeth Orthodox Church in Polsbo, we should not evangelize with the sword. Let's not do that. But this was being done by people with power, because they're like, that's the thing. They have power. But there are other examples. Like, think of Vladimir of Kiev. Vladimir of Russia, of Kiev. He, in 988, converts. He was one of those warlords, one of those Slavic warlords with a Scandinavian kind of heritage, Viking, you might say, heritage. And he had come to power through horrible violence, awful brutality and violence. But he was a pagan, and he's worshiping Perun and all this stuff. We won't go into his life right now. But when he converts to Christianity in about 988, he orders the statue of Perun and the other pagan gods to be destroyed, and he orders that bread wagons be sent throughout Kiev to help the poor on Saturdays. He does all these things, invites the common people to his palace for love feasts, like before he was killing people and having orgies almost at his palace. And now it's like this Christianization of all of that. Most maybe remarkably, Vladimir, ruler of Russia, with all this background, once he becomes a Christian and is exposed to the gospel and the Sermon on the Mount, right? You've heard it said of old, but I tell you, do it in a different way, according to the heaven and not this world. Transform and transfigure this world, in other words. Vladimir orders that people not be put to death for capital crimes, that there be no capital punishment. And he's actually talked out of this by the bishops of all people. But that was his instinct, is like apply Christianity in its maximum form. So there were variations. There was Charlemagne baptizing with the sword in Germany. There was Vladimir ordering an end to capital punishment in Kiev. And there was lots of other things along the way. It's in this environment then that King Olaf of Norway comes to power. He was a Viking lord, a chieftain. He rose up in the ranks and in those circles of remorseless Viking raiders. He raided Estonia, I think it was. He certainly made his way to England, where he spent some time in England as well, which was under the thumb of Scandinavia at this time. He finally finds his way to northern France, to Rouen, where in about 1010 or 1012, I think there's disagreement among historians when it happens, he is baptized. He's baptized. So he wasn't baptized until then, which is interesting. He wasn't just naturally or inevitably baptized, because Scandinavia at this time, Christianity was rather rare, even though there had been some Christian kings before him, like Haakon the Good and people like that. Nevertheless, he wasn't a Christian until he was baptized. Once baptized, he comes back to Norway, and he begins to Christianize Norway. And so we can just kind of note that here as we kind of reach, kind of approach the end of the talk today. He starts off in this brutal mode of being part of this horrible, monstrous, unspeakable violence. And even so, because there are Christians in this world, many of them uncanonized saints, that is to say, saints that we don't know about, saints like those monks that were brought back from monasteries and made human sacrifices maybe before him when he was maybe a teenager growing up in Norway, and seeing these Christians meekly go to their death, or seeing other Christian slaves and talking to these slaves and noticing that they're not, their lives aren't ruined because they're slaves, because they believe in God and they see their salvation as being more than just what happens to them in this world. He was influenced by this, impacted by this, and he converted. And then he brought that faith that he converted to, Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, back to his homeland, Norway, where he became the king. And during his short reign, it wasn't a very long one. By most estimates, it wasn't a very successful one either. He tried to bring Christianity beyond the kind of coastland where it made some initial impact because of the contact Vikings had with Christendom. He tried to bring it inland, where those farming communities I mentioned earlier were located. But there he found paganism really entrenched. really entrenched. You know, the pagan fertility rites and the whole thing about, like, you know, if your crops don't grow, you die, right? And so they're seeing their gods and goddesses as being necessary for keeping the crops growing and keeping the rural kind of life going and all that stuff. And so they really resisted Christianization. Now, Olaf is, we know very little about Olaf. That's the first thing that can be said. We know very little about Olaf. Snorri Sturluson is a famous 13th century chronicler of Norwegian rulers, and he wrote a book called the Heimskringla, which documented some of this 2 centuries after Olaf. And there were other people too. And what they said about Olaf is, you know, it's, you don't really get a whole lot. You don't get a whole lot. But it seems to be the case that Olaf brought back with him from France, Normandy, from England especially, he brought back missionaries. He brought back bishops in some cases and missionaries. And he brought them back to Norway in order that Norway might convert to Christianity. And he brought these people back, and they started to get the work on the ground, converting, building up an ecclesiastical structure, building churches, things like this. The most famous among these missionaries was Grimkettel. He was an English cleric, probably just a priest, who met Olaf during his years in England, and Olaf was so impressed with his holiness and his dedication to the gospel that he brought him back to Norway with him, and he became kind of the chief bishop and missionary under Olaf at his court. He helped establish the cathedral in Trondheim, the famous city Trondheim in Norway. And so Olaf begins the process of Christianization. Now, this process seems also to have that Charlemagne-like element of violence in it sometimes, at least to read the chronicles, like Snorri's chronicle. You read that, and he's using, you know, he's saying that, you know, he doesn't talk much about Christianization. He's not interested in that, frankly. He's interested in battle. But he does mention that Olaf was a very militant leader, and that he would often demand that the people he conquered would become Christian. Now there are exceptions to that, and what we're going to have all our saints up on our ceiling are going to hold a scroll, and there'll be a text for that scroll, and the text for Olaf is probably going to read, it's going to be a statement by him, where he just observes that there's an anecdote from Olaf's life where he came across some very elite pagan warlords, like a kind of a combat regiment or something, and he really wanted them to join his army, because they were really good in battle. But he said, you must be Christian to do so, because I'm not going to have any pagans in my army. And they say, no, we're pagan, you know, we believe in Odin or whatever it is, and we're not going to do that. And so they wouldn't. And Olaf finally laments something like, it is a sad thing when a man, a vigorous, strong young man, refuses to honor his as creator as the source of all his strength, or something like that. And by the way, he let them live. He didn't kill them or something like that, just for the record. So there were cases where he wasn't violent toward people who refused to convert, but in some cases he seems to have had a violent streak in him. And that's a reality. That's the sinner part of the saint. Is in his case, with all that power, in that kind of worldly environment. Remember what Irenaeus of Lyon says: we don't just check out of the world when we become Christians. We sanctify the world. We change and transform the world in which we live. But the world is still there, and we're still engaged with it and living within it. And so he was living in that world of violent conquest. And to think that he'd just suddenly become like, you know, an absolute kind of angel in the flesh or something like that, that's just not, you know, that's not what happened. I mean, we can just say that's not what happened. That's not what happened. And he certainly committed sins, like any Christian with power commits sins. Like what Christian with power doesn't commit sin, right? And you don't have to be king to do this either. You can just be a husband. You can be a wife. You can be a factory owner. You can be a whatever. You know, Christians when they have power, always have a challenge to use that power in a holy way or not. And often we Christians often don't do it. But sometimes Olaf did that. And he was so dedicated to bringing the gospel of Jesus Christ to Norway, a Norway that resisted that gospel because of its indigenous, pagan, religious resistance to the gospel of love of one's neighbor, of mercy, and all those things that Christianity stands for. Olaf did a remarkable thing. Not perfectly, not without flaw, not without mistake, not without violence in some cases, but in other cases he did it. He brought Christianity more fully into the life of his native people, the Norwegians, even though they didn't really think of themselves as the Norwegians at this time. He brought that Christianity to his people. Now, with time, and here I'll wrap up his story, with time, Olaf was expelled from Norway, overthrown and expelled by a reaction of the nobility, the pagan nobility. The pagan nobility reacted against all of these developments, especially the Christianization of Norway. And so finally, Olaf has to flee. He winds up, actually, of all places, Russia. That is to say, Novgorod. And he has contact with the rulers like Yaroslav the Wise of Novgorod. Yaroslav the Wise was the son of St. Vladimir of Kiev. And some of his successors, too, like the famous and wild man Harald Hardrada. Anyone know about Harald Hardrada? Yeah, he's quite a guy. He'll come later. Anyway, he also spent time in Russia, Christian Russia. Anyway, finally, King Canute seizes power in Norway in Olaf's absence. I think the year is 1028. And Olaf decides to go back to Norway, raise a new army, and fight the allies of King Canute. And at a famous battle called the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, Olaf's forces are defeated by those arrayed against them, largely driven by a pagan reaction and noble reaction to the royal, kind of monarchical and Christian vision for a Norway that Olaf had brought. And he's finally killed on the battlefield. It's very unclear because there are many sources and they don't agree at all. But he's killed by a figure, a chieftain called Thorir Hund. And he is a pagan that long had opposed Olaf as one of the heads of the nobility or chieftains. He was one of the leadership in resisting Christianization of Norway. And at this battle of Stiklestad, he kills, he's the one who inflicts the mortal wound. There's a couple of other people who also inflict wounds on Olaf, but Olaf falls and dies at that battle in 1030. And so that's the end of his life. Not like a martyr being, killed in an arena in Rome. He's on the battlefield. He's waging a war. He's fighting and killing. And so he is a very different kind of person than, the Apostle Peter being crucified upside down in Rome or something like that. Very different, for sure. But remember, Christianity is about the sanctification of the entire world. And there is an endless diversity to the human race. When we paint those icons in our barrel vault at St. Elizabeth this fall, that's the point. There will be men and women. There will be rich and poor. There will be people from all sorts of nations and countries. There'll be a Chinese woman up there. There'll be an African man up there. Everything. We'll have children up there as well, for our children to look up and see that yes, a girl or a boy, not yet an adult, can be a canonized saint as well. Every human being is made in the image of God, and whatever historical world circumstances that human being is born into, that human being baptized into Christ can bring holiness into this world. And so Olaf of Norway brought holiness. That's not to say he never sinned. He did. He was a sinner. But he also brought holiness, and he was also a saint. And so that's why we remember him. And the moment he died, the Norwegians remembered him. Grimkettle, the missionary he brought with him, The following year declares him a saint, canonizes him at Trondheim. Churches immediately are dedicated to Olaf of Norway. And not just in Norway, but in England, in Russia, and even distant Constantinople. Constantinople is one of the first places to have a chapel dedicated to Saint Olaf of Norway in the 11th century. Icons are painted of him. We have the earliest icon is thought to be in Bethlehem. Bethlehem, like wow, like he was never there. Bethlehem, and it shows Olaf of Norway. Other icons are painted with time, and sometimes Olaf is shown astride or on top of a serpent or dragon, having slain the dragon. This is found like in other icons of like St. George, the trophy bearer. But in the case of Olaf, it's a dragon. And this has been interpreted as the dragon, like the dragon represents chaos and the cosmos that's unbaptized, unsanctified, untransfigured by the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's, like we have our throne. It's at the church, it's behind the altar, so it's not easy to see for most people, but we have that throne. And the throne at our church is modeled on an 11th century Norwegian episcopal throne in Norway. And it's modeled on that, and it shows two dragons being separated, their dragons' heads being separated by the cross in the center of the throne. When our bishop comes to our church, he has a staff that has two dragons being driven away. Like that's a symbol of chaos being destroyed as the gospel of peace establishes itself in this world. We have all sorts of images of dragons in our Orthodox iconographical heritage, and in those made of Olaf of Norway, they show him, as it were, standing on a defeated dragon. And some people interpret that the dragon to be a representation not of paganism in Norway, but of the violence that Olaf inherited from his life, from the world in which he lived, in that part of the world at that particular time in the history of the world. And that this was always something he was battling himself, within himself. And every Christian, we all know, we're fighting against our passions all the time. That's what becoming a saint is all about, is fighting against our passions. Not saying yes to them, not just saying, oh, I'm a sinner, or oh, I'm a whatever. That's just who I am. Fill in all the blanks you can come up with there. But rather not to accept those fallen, darkened, benighted standards of this world, but because of the gospel, to struggle against them and overcome them. And so those icons of St. Olaf of Norway, painted at an early stage in his veneration as a canonized saint, show him having defeated that dragon, And that's an example to all Christians who, whether they have royal power or not, the power of a Viking army behind them or not, every Christian has something in them that lurks like a dragon that can be reduced to anger and hostility toward other people. And Olaf is presented as someone who fought that fight. So those are some comments then about St. Olaf of Norway. We have a few minutes left before we're done here today. And if anyone has questions or comments, I'd love to hear them. Yeah, Reader Vladimir.
After his death, a couple of decades later, you got the famous Harald Hardrada, as you mentioned. I don't recall if he was Christian or not.
He was. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And my question then is, was Christianity pretty well established from then on, or did they go up and down? And now we're pagan. Oh, next thing is Christian.
I think that's a great question, and I'm not a Norwegian historian, and I wouldn't be fair for me to say I know. I don't know. But my sense, Reader Vladimir, is that King Olaf is kind of the turning point rather than Harald Hardrada. It's really King Olaf of Norway's tenure, which is a short tenure and kind of a confused tenure, but nevertheless, his rule, his reign is kind of the point beyond, after which historians would consider Norway to be, a Christian land that's officially Christian and becomes more and more so with time. And Harald Hardrada plays a role in that. Yeah.
You said a local bishop canonized Olaf,
Yes.
was that a normal procedure, or what would have been the normal?
That's a great question, yeah. Because back then, 1,000 years ago, what today is considered like a almost judicial review of a person's character, that's often done with canonization decisions, was not done. It was a local decision, often with the piety of the people. For instance, a year after the Battle of Stiklestad, they uncovered, so very soon they take his relics and take him to Trondheim. A year later, they discover that they haven't decomposed, and they take that as a miracle. Other people report miracles that through prayer to Olaf, they had miracles occur in their life. And so local decisions are made by local communities, and this particular missionary bishop, who obviously identified with Olaf, was all for that. And so he seems to be the one who started declaring that Olaf is a saint, is officially a saint. So almost right from the beginning. But it wasn't like like the Roman Catholic Church today, for instance. We're Orthodox, but not Roman Catholic. But the Roman Catholic Church has this very, very scrupulous process to assure that people are not canonized that later turn out to be like dubious people. And so it's become much more kind of, like you may say, judicial today, and process focused. But back then it wasn't so. Much more spontaneous. Yeah. Any other questions about Olaf and his times, or just?
How old was he in 1030?
Oh, good question. I don't know when he was born. I came across it, I just didn't write it down. Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I would guess not very old. Yeah. If he's in battle, in other words, when he falls. Mike?
Do you remember what date was when Norway became a Lutheran country?
And again, I'm not a Norwegian historian, but it's interesting to think about the history of Norway after its founder, because I think most Norwegians think of Saint Olaf as the founder of Norway, the great saint of Norway. I'll answer your question by fitting it within a larger history that I did want to just mention briefly. We're Orthodox Christians, so we really take seriously the fact that before the Great Schism, which separates Western Christianity from Orthodox Christianity, the West was Orthodox, and we see people like Olaf of Norway, who's a Western saint, as being one of our saints, or Aidan of Lindisfarne, or whoever that might be. So the schism takes place in 1054. At that point, we'd start to say, okay, about that time, we're talking about a Roman Catholic Norway. Then the Protestant Reformation takes place, and Lutheranism comes to Norway, your question, in 1537, I believe, in Norway. And it remains the state religion all the way up until 1969 in Norway, at which time freedom of religion is declared, at least in principle. Norway continues today to favor the Lutheran Church, so Lutheran churches are given a kind of a special kind of advantage in society or by the government legally. But strictly speaking, Norway is a country today where freedom of religion is part of the constitutional democratic system. And so you might say from, therefore, 1537, the Protestant Reformation, up to 1969, Norway is Lutheran in its identity that way. And of course, remains Lutheran today. It's predominantly Lutheran. 70%, I think, of the population. Although that ticks down constantly, right? I mean, that's going down all the time. Today, Norway is probably better called, like so many other countries in the West, secular or pluralistic. And we have Orthodox missions. Just a few years ago, we had Father Svana here giving a talk on Norwegian Christianity, Orthodox priest from Bergen, Norway. I just got an email a couple days ago from a couple brothers from Sweden who discovered Orthodoxy in Sweden. I know Sweden is not Norway, don't hit me, but I'm just saying. It's close, right? You have to admit, you have to admit Sweden is not far from Norway on the map. A couple of Swedes are coming here to our area, and they want to research Orthodox Christianity in America so they can take back a model of that to Sweden. And I told them about Amber and how she, had a very strong interest in missionary work in Sweden. And she actually made it, didn't she, to Stockholm? I think she was.
Yeah, she was in Stockholm once.
Yeah, so.
She met with the Metropolitan there.
Yeah.
The Greek Orthodox Church.
Yeah. So today Norway is a multicultural, multi-religious place where Orthodox missions are being planted, just like in Sweden. Yeah. Okay. No. Yeah. One. Yeah. Peter Fielder.
I was just gonna add on to what you were saying there. It's interesting to note that a lot of the countries that adopted Protestantism, particularly Lutheranism, were countries whose languages were not Romance-based, i.e., unlike France, Italy, Spain, those countries where instead their language was Germanic-based, and the Christians of the West, the Western, under Rome, insisted that Latin be the liturgical language, and especially codified that in the Council of Trent.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just very interesting to note that most of the Germanic languaged countries became Lutheran, or basically split off from the Catholic Church. Vice the Latin speaking were the Romance language ones that stayed within the Catholic Church's anus.
Yeah, and almost right from the start that new order is set in stone, so that there's almost no change thereafter. Today's secularization is changing things, but you don't have, like, after the Reformation, the first century or whatever, that's it. Lutheranism is where it's going to stay, and Calvinism is where it's going to stay, and Roman Catholicism is where it's going to stay in the West. Yeah, and it was maybe definitely a Germanic thing. Yeah.
Where did his relics end up?
In Trondheim, I believe. Yeah. But they were despoiled during the Protestant Reformation. So soon after the Protestant Reformation, I think they disappear. That happened, of course, in England during the Protestant Reformation, and other parts of the West, where there was this iconoclastic and anti-saints relic kind of theology in a lot of Protestantism, and so they got rid of a lot of that stuff, or stuff, the holy relics, not stuff, but you know what I mean. They got rid of that, just like, famously in England with the relics of Thomas Becket and stuff like that at Canterbury Cathedral. Yeah, those are all gone.
Who's King Olaf II Haraldson, the King Olaf that baptized Lake Haraldson?
Was he the same one who did that? I don't know. I don't know that question. I'm sorry. Oh, is it that you're saying it is true? Yeah.
No, I'm just saying that's what I get. Depending on what version, if it's Snorri Sturluson or somebody from Norway that writes history, they get more, I guess, local, and stories just kind of stretch out.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure that can be found out pretty easily, though. Yeah. Okay, yeah. Mike.
Washington State was the only one that named a beer after a saint, Ole.
Ole, there we go. Okay. We'll leave it on that. Yeah, but are there any other questions? Any other comments? Yes, Michael.
Do you know if he had any children that were
Yes, Magnusson, I think is his patronymic. I think, yeah. So after Olaf dies, Canute fails to get control of Norway, and the Norwegians reject Canute's kind of influence and appoint the offspring, I think, of Saint Olaf. Yes, I think so. Yeah, I know less about what follows, but I think that's the case. Yeah. Okay, yeah, Reader Vladimir, one final one.
Not so much a question, but I was raised Lutheran, like probably a few others in this room, and as you can see, it didn't take. But we Lutherans never knew quite what to do with saints. There was a big iconoclastic period, like I said, was smash all these relics and all this stuff. And then after that eased down, well, it was fine to name churches after saints. And if a saint was really important to a certain area, like Saint King Olaf, you're not going to get rid of that.
Mm-hmm.
So I was raised in St. Mark Lutheran Church, and I heard nothing about saints except that was the name of our church.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm sure in Norway it went something like that also, where St. Olaf, we'll name everything St. Olaf, whatever, but nothing else about saints. We won't go there.
Mm-hmm. Or even about him very much. Yeah. Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah. Yeah, well, we're here to address that, I think, yeah. Okay, everyone, so that's it. And 2 weeks at our church will be another talk, the second, The Girl Who Defied Social Expectations About Wealth, Wisdom, and Beauty, Great Martyr Catherine of Egypt. I want to thank Sons of Norway. Thank you so much back there for letting us have this beautiful upper room here, and thanks so much. Christ is risen.